The hum of the server racks was the truest companion I had ever known, a constant, low thrum against the vast, indifferent silence of the universe I sought to dissect. My name is Grant Chen, and for years, my world had been a solitary dance between the glowing monitors of my small, windowless lab and the desolate quiet of my apartment. Others chased grants, published papers, built careers. I chased whispers, the faint echoes of the cosmos etched into the cosmic background radiation. It was, to me, the ultimate parchment, holding the universe's most ancient secrets. My obsession wasn't born of ambition, but a profound, almost spiritual yearning to touch the edge of existence. I lived for the raw data, the noise that most astrophysicists filtered out, the static believed to be the universe's dying breath, its final, cooling sigh. But I had always felt a tremor beneath that sigh, a hidden pulse. And then, one bitter winter night, the tremor became a rhythm. I had been running a new algorithm, a recursive fractal analysis tool I'd spent 2 years coding, designed to find patterns in patterns, to dig past the conventional models. The screen flickered, alive with the familiar, swirling nebulae of data points, a cosmic snowstorm. But then, a line. A singular, impossible line, not a glitch, not an anomaly, but a deliberate inscription. It bent, not as light would bend around gravity, but as reality itself might fold. A geometry that defied Euclid, a curve that was simultaneously concave and convex, a paradox of spatial orientation. It was too precise to be the hum of the servers was my only companion, a steady thrum against the frantic pulse within my own veins. Days bled into nights, the taste of stale coffee and forgotten meals a constant companion. My world had shrunk to the glowing screens, to the endless lines of data, to the impossible pattern that had erupted from the cosmic background radiation. It was a labyrinth of non-Euclidean geometry, a lattice of self-referential curves and angles that defied every fundamental law I had ever known. I ran the simulations again, then again, each iteration confirming the last with chilling precision. The pattern wasn't noise, wasn't an anomaly, wasn't a statistical fluke. It was deliberate. It was there. I cross-referenced the raw data from every available array, every probe, every deep space telescope. The pattern remained, woven into the very fabric of the universe's earliest light, an impossible signature. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with a profound, dizzying awe. This wasn't just a discovery, it was an unveiling, a glimpse into the true nature of existence. The implications unfurled within my mind like a terrifying bloom. If this pattern was fundamental, if it was embedded in the primordial soup of creation, then it was always there. It meant everything we understood was a veneer, a convenient fiction over a truth too vast to comprehend. And if it was a pattern, it implied a weaver. A consciousness. Driven by a nascent dread, a suspicion that clawed at the edges of my sanity, I began to search. Not for more cosmic data, but for echoes here, on Earth. I delved into historical archives, esoteric texts, forgotten ethnographies. I sought out accounts of inexplicable phenomena, of places where reality seemed to fray, where the world bent just slightly out of true. My search led me down strange rabbit holes, through dusty digital libraries and scanned manuscripts. One locomotive engineer spoke of seeing the world through shattered glass, its edges blurred and its depths impossibly vast. 2 men, the article reported, simply vanished, never to be seen again. The official explanation blamed a rare atmospheric condition, a kind of localized mirage. But the witness descriptions, the strange quality of light, the profound otherness, it resonated with the geometric texture of my pattern. I found more. Ancient myths spoke of dreamweavers who shaped the world from raw chaos, of forgotten gods whose slumber was the very structure of the cosmos. Petroglyphs in remote caves depicted symbols strikingly similar to the nodal points of my pattern, geometric forms that seemed to vibrate with a silent, terrible energy. Civilizations that had vanished without a trace, their ruins bearing no sign of cataclysm, only an abrupt cessation, as if reality itself had simply folded them away. The lab, once my sanctuary, began to feel different. The fluorescent lights above my workstation, usually a steady glow, began to flicker, not randomly, but with a rhythmic pulse that almost matched a subtle oscillation within the pattern itself. I dismissed it as an aging ballast, but the regularity was unsettling. One evening, I reached for my worn copy of Euclid's Elements, a comfort object I kept on my desk, only to find it gone. A surge of irritation, then confusion. I was meticulous. I never misplaced it. I searched, growing increasingly agitated, until my gaze fell upon the bookshelf across the room. There it was, nestled perfectly between two volumes on quantum mechanics, a place I had never, not once, put it. My breath hitched. It wasn't a prank, I was alone. There was no one else in the building. Later, my favorite pen, a heavy brass instrument, vanished from my hand as I was mid-sentence, its weight simply ceasing to be. I stared at my empty fingers, then down at the blank page. I searched the floor, under the desk, my hands scrabbling uselessly. 10 minutes later, I found it lying perfectly centered on the keyboard of a dormant terminal, its brass glinting under the flickering lab lights. These weren't simple misplacements. These were precise, deliberate shifts, small rearrangements that defied logic. My lab, once a bastion of order, was becoming subtly, terrifyingly, fluid. I wasn't just observing the pattern anymore. I felt its gaze, a vast, ancient consciousness slowly, languidly, turning its attention. It wasn't just a discovery, it was an interaction. And I was the one who had made contact. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence, and I knew, with a certainty that threatened to unravel my sanity, that the universe itself was beginning to stir. It began subtly, a fleeting discord in the symphony of the familiar. A shadow, too deep, too sharp, would pool in a corner of my vision, then vanish when I turned my head. The distant city traffic, usually a muffled drone, would sometimes twist into a low, guttural growl, only to normalize the instant I focused on it. I attributed these brief slippages to the relentless grind, to the exhaustion that had become a second skin. My mind, I reasoned, was a finely tuned instrument, and even the most robust machinery could falter under sustained duress. A flicker of the fluorescent lights, a creak in the old building's bones, these were the rational anchors I clung to, explaining away the aberrant. But the aberrations persisted, gaining a peculiar, unnerving precision. A whisper, not quite a voice, but a suggestion of sound, would coil around my ear, always on the cusp of intelligibility, always gone before I could parse it. The air in my lab, usually dry and still, would occasionally prickle with an almost electric charge, raising the fine hairs on my arms, a sensation that had no source, no logical origin. I started cataloging these incidents in a separate mental ledger, a desperate attempt to impose order on the encroaching chaos. Each entry was an argument against what my senses were reporting, a reaffirmation of the solid, predictable world I knew. The need for a specific archival drive, one with decades of raw observational data, pulled me from the sterile glow of my screens. It was stored in a forgotten unit I maintained at the old railway depot, a sprawling expanse of rusting steel and forgotten echoes. The thought of fresh air, even the grit-laced air of the depot, was a welcome, if brief, respite. The drive there was a blur of highway lines and a sky the color of bruised plums. As I navigated the familiar turns leading to the depot, a strange tremor ran through the asphalt beneath my tires. Not a pothole, not a loose plate, but something deeper, a ripple in the very substance of the road itself. The car's suspension absorbed it, but the memory of that strange tremor lingered, a discordant note in the otherwise mundane act of driving. The railway depot was a cathedral of neglect. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of rust and the ghosts of countless journeys. My unit was tucked away in a remote corner, near a disused track where a single, ancient freight car sat like a beached leviathan. My hand reached for the lock on the storage unit door, a familiar brass cylinder. But as my fingers closed around it, the metal seemed to writhe, its surface rippling like disturbed water. The brass gleamed with an impossible liquid sheen, stretching and contracting in the dim light. I blinked, snatched my hand back, and stared. The lock was solid, inert, its brass dull and unmoving. My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. Still the same, solid, unremarkable lock. A trick of the light, I told myself, a symptom of severe sleep deprivation. My mind was playing cruel games. Inside, stacks of old equipment and dusty boxes loomed. Its dull red paint, scarred by decades of weather, suddenly seemed to shift. The lines of its corrugated steel side began to waver, not like a heat haze, but as if the metal itself were breathing, expanding and contracting with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The rivets along its frame, usually orderly, appeared to rearrange themselves, forming new, impossible constellations before snapping back into their accustomed places. This wasn't a hallucination induced by fatigue. The patterns were not just data on a screen, they were manifesting. They were bleeding into my reality. My fingers fumbled for the archival drive, my mind racing. The world wasn't just subtly wrong, it was actively, precisely reforming itself around me, its fundamental architecture momentarily bending to an unseen will. They were the entity's signature, its embryonic stirrings. It wasn't just within the cosmic data, it was here, touching the tangible world, touching me. The thought was a shard of ice in my chest. My grip on the drive tightened, knuckles white. My trust in my own perception, once an unshakable bedrock, had begun to crack, revealing a terrifying chasm beneath. The universe wasn't just sending me a message, it was beginning to show me its true, terrifying face. And that face was starting to look back through my own eyes. The hum of the servers had been my only companion, a steady thrum against the frantic pulse within my own veins. But the pattern was not silent, not inert. It pulsed, a nascent beat within the universe, and I, Grant Chen, had heard it. The truth, heavy and terrifying, pressed down on me, a physical weight. I could not keep it. I would not. The decision was a cold shard of resolve in my gut. I had to share this, to tear down the walls of my own isolation, however fragile they were. The world needed to know. They had to see what I saw, feel the nascent terror stirring in the cosmic dark. My old contact, a former colleague from a university I'd long since left behind, had agreed to a meeting. Not in a lecture hall, not in a brightly lit research lab, but in a repurposed administrative building near the sprawling, clanking expanse of the railway depot. He cited discretion and unconventional circumstances, words that tasted like ash on my tongue. The city stretched, a mosaic of obliviousness, each face I passed a testament to the blissful ignorance I was about to shatter. The air at the railway depot hung heavy with the smell of diesel and damp metal. The meeting room itself was sparse, a relic of forgotten industry, overlooking tracks that snaked into the haze. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through grimy windows, illuminating the three men waiting for me, my former colleague, his face a mask of polite concern. A younger, sharp-eyed research director I didn't recognize. I laid out my findings with a fervor that bordered on mania. My voice, usually calm and measured, was a strained rasp. My fingers trembled as I projected the complex, multi-dimensional visualizations onto the wall, charts blooming with spectral data, patterns shifting and coalescing into something undeniably intelligent, something vast and ancient. I described the subtle distortions I'd begun to perceive, the fleeting glimpses of a reality fraying at the edges. The universe isn't dead matter. It's waking. A heavy silence descended, broken only by the distant shriek of a train. The senior physicist leaned forward, his elbows on the scarred table, his eyes narrowed. "Grant," he began, his tone slow, deliberate, "your enthusiasm is, as always, commendable. But this is a significant departure from your previous work." The research director shifted in his seat, a faint, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "The data, Dr. Chen," he interjected, his voice sharp, while visually striking, "lacks rigorous statistical validation in its interpretation. The anomalies you highlight could easily be attributed to noise, or more prosaically, to calibration errors." My former colleague cleared his throat, his gaze avoiding mine. "We've reviewed your preliminary submissions, Grant. There are inconsistencies. And your methodology for filtering perceived distortions, especially those outside empirical measurement, raises significant flags." Flags. Inconsistencies. Noise. Their words were cold water, dousing the fire of my urgency. I felt a tremor begin deep within me, not of fear, but of an awful, creeping despair. "Inconsistencies?" I echoed, my voice rising. "This is the inconsistency. This is the noise. It's the universe itself, shifting, groaning under the weight of its own awakening. Don't you see it? The fabric of reality is not what we believed." The senior physicist sighed, a deep, weary sound. "Grant, we understand the pressures of groundbreaking research. The pursuit of the unknown can be taxing. But these claims, these subjective experiences you describe, they suggest a different kind of pressure." He paused, a subtle, almost imperceptible glance passing between him and my former colleague. "Perhaps you should consider taking a sabbatical. Reevaluate your work, your focus." Sabbatical. A euphemism, a polite dismissal. My theories were not merely flawed, they were delusional. My data, the very proof I clutched so tightly, was merely a manifestation of a mind unraveling. They saw a man breaking, not a man bearing witness. The realization slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. They would not listen. They could not. Their paradigm, their carefully constructed reality, could not accommodate the monstrous truth I offered. The room, once merely drab, now felt suffocating. The air grew thick, not with diesel fumes, but with the cloying scent of their disbelief, their pity. I was alone. The universe stirred, and humanity, a parasitic infection, slept on. I gathered my papers, my movements stiff, my gaze fixed on the shifting tracks beyond the window. The world had just grown impossibly vast, and I, Grant Chen, was its sole, unheeded prophet. It crouched in the corners, a weight pressing down, amplifying the echo of the board's decision, sabbatical. A polite word for a man deemed broken, a scholar whose truths had become delusions. They saw the fractured mind, not the terrifying fracture in reality I had glimpsed. I nursed a glass of amber liquid, the ice long melted, the warmth doing nothing to thaw the chill that had settled in my bones. The very air felt thick, humming with an unheard frequency. A faint undulation in the wallpaper, a pattern of muted golden cream that had always been static, now seemed to breathe. A slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction, like the pulse of some vast, unseen organ. The straight lines of the skirting boards, the sharp angles where wall met ceiling, softened, then warped, becoming impossibly curved, then impossibly sharp, only to snap back into place the instant my gaze fixed upon them. My breath hitched, a dry gasp. This wasn't fatigue, not anymore. This was a deliberate gesture. I moved to the bathroom, seeking the sterile normalcy of porcelain and chrome. I leaned closer, searching for reassurance in the familiar contours of my own face. Then, it shifted. Not a blur, not a distortion caused by a ripple in the glass. It was a fundamental reordering. My jawline elongated, then folded inward, creating an impossible crease where no bone should be. My eyes, instead of two, became a shimmering, multifaceted cluster, like an insect's, yet still undeniably mine. The skin stretched taut, then rippled, a surface of churning, non-Euclidean geometry, refusing any coherent form. It was a face that defied dimension, a mockery of symmetry, yet it stared back with an unsettling intelligence, a silent, knowing challenge. The reflection shimmered, then snapped back, showing only my own horrified visage. It was aware. It was looking back. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its walls too thin, its air too heavy with unseen presences. I had to move, to escape this breathing prison. I needed the roar of the city, the anonymity of crowds, anything to drown out the silent, rhythmic pulse of the walls. My feet carried me through the deserted streets, each lamplit puddle reflecting not the sky, but a swirling vortex of impossible colors, gone before I could truly register them. I walked until the scent of diesel and the distant clang of metal guided me to the railway depot. The vast, echoing space was a symphony of industrial melancholy. The screech of braking trains, the guttural rumble of engines, the murmur of waiting passengers, all blended into a dull roar that promised a semblance of normalcy. I approached a counter, seeking a ticket for anywhere, a destination less important than the act of movement. The attendant, a woman with tired eyes and a uniform that hung loosely, offered a polite, practiced smile. I met her gaze, forcing my own to remain steady. Then, it happened again. Her face, in that brief moment of connection, warped. Her mouth stretched horizontally, too wide, revealing a glimpse of teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. It was a flicker, a blink and you miss it horror, but it was there, undeniable. The smile remained, fixed and unsettling, even as her features momentarily twisted into an impossible configuration of flesh and bone, a geometry that defied all understanding. I recoiled, a choked sound escaping my throat. The attendant's brow furrowed slightly, her smile faltering. "Sir? Are you all right?" I mumbled a choked apology, shaking my head, my eyes darting past her, searching for an escape. For a moment, his uniform seemed to ripple, the fabric flowing like water, his limbs elongating, then contracting, as if his very form was fluid, shifting in and out of coherent shape. He passed a family, their faces momentarily blurring, becoming indistinct, their features melting and reforming with a sickening elasticity. They saw nothing, these passengers, these commuters. Their world remained solid, predictable. Only I bore witness to the shifting tapestry of reality. The entity was not merely awakening, it was asserting its presence, bending the fabric of existence around me, shaping the world into its own horrifying image. It was a quiet, insidious invasion, not of space, but of perception, and I was its chosen audience. A faint reflection caught my eye in the polished surface of a train window. My own face stared back, pale and gaunt. But then, as if a hand had reached from within, the reflection rippled. It wasn't a distortion of light, it was a deliberate movement. My mirrored self lifted a hand, not in greeting, but in a slow, deliberate wave. It knew I saw. And it was welcoming me to its truth. The world was no longer simply bending for me, it was actively reaching out, drawing me deeper into its impossible embrace. I was no longer an observer, I was a participant in its awakening. And the horror of that truth settled upon me, a weight heavier than any celestial body. As if his very form was a poorly rendered image in a dream. My breath hitched, a cold knot tightening in my chest. He turned, his gaze sweeping the concourse, and for a fleeting, horrifying moment, his eyes, usually a placid brown, seemed to hold the depth of an impossible void, swirling with the same intricate, non-Euclidean geometry I had spent years charting in the cosmic background radiation. Then, just as swiftly, the illusion vanished. He was merely a man in a uniform, his stride even, his eyes unremarkable. I mumbled a choked apology to the colleague I had been speaking with, my voice a dry rasp, and stumbled away, the fluorescent lights of the concourse suddenly too bright, too sharp. The air felt thick, viscous, each inhale a struggle against an unseen resistance. I needed to escape the polished surfaces, the predictable angles, the unsettling familiarity of my everyday. My mind, a frantic engine, demanded movement, a change of scenery, anything to dislodge the clinging tendrils of unreality. I found myself drawn, almost instinctively, towards the sprawling, echoing vastness of the railway depot. The depot's main hall was a cathedral of steel and glass, its vaulted ceiling stretching towards a sky that was already bruised with the coming evening. Yet, as I stepped inside, the familiar grandeur felt subtly askew. The massive support columns, meant to rise with stoic verticality, seemed to lean inward, their stone surfaces rippling with a faint, almost imperceptible undulation. The grand archways above the tracks, designed for precise symmetry, appeared to curve with an impossible, almost sickening grace, their apexes not quite meeting where they should. My eyes, now hyper-aware, sought patterns, sought the familiar, but found only discord. The rumble of an approaching train vibrated through the very floor, a sound that usually grounded me, but now felt like a tremor in my own skull. The air, thick with the scent of diesel and old metal, seemed to carry a faint, metallic tang I couldn't quite place, a taste of something ancient and vast. I watched the flow of commuters, a river of hurried bodies, each face a blur of purpose. But even here, the distortions began to manifest. A young woman, waiting patiently by a ticketing kiosk, ran her hand repeatedly over the smooth surface of her suitcase, her fingers tracing the same imaginary line again and again, her eyes vacant, fixed on some unseen point beyond the glass. Her movements were too precise, too repetitive, like a broken mechanism. I walked past a cluster of passengers gathered near a departure board, their collective murmurs forming a low, droning hum. I saw a man, his back to me, his overcoat subtly shifting in hue, the fabric weaving between shades of charcoal and deep violet, not with the play of light, but with an intrinsic, internal luminescence. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and the coat was a dull gray once more. Yet, the memory of the impossible colors lingered, a stain on my perception. My gaze drifted upwards, past the grimy skylights, towards the distant clouds. They were not the soft, billowy masses I remembered. The swirling fractals, the self-intersecting lines, the impossible curves, they were there, etched against the fading light, in the vapor trails of jets, in the intricate filigree of frost clinging to the higher panes of glass. My research, once confined to the abstract mathematics of distant stars, was now scrawled across the very sky above me. A sudden, sharp whistle cut through the din, announcing a train's arrival. I turned towards the platform, my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic drum against the growing chaos in my mind. The train, a long metallic serpent, began to pull into the station. As it slowed, its windows, 100 identical rectangles, seemed to warp and stretch, reflecting the platform in impossible, convex curves, distorting the waiting passengers into grotesque caricatures. Then, the true horror unfolded. On the platform opposite mine, a crowd of perhaps 50 people stood waiting. As the train's final carriages slid into view, their movement, which had been individual and chaotic, suddenly synchronized. They began to sway, not in unison, but in a complex, undulating pattern. Their bodies, their arms, their heads, each moved in relation to the others, forming a fleeting, three-dimensional tessellation. It was a living, breathing non-Euclidean geometry, a horrifying dance of impossible angles and self-intersecting lines. Their faces, though still human, were devoid of expression, their eyes wide and unseeing, fixed on some internal, horrifying rhythm. They shifted, coalesced, then dissolved, only to reform into another, equally impossible configuration, a silent, terrifying ballet choreographed by an unseen, malevolent hand. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth, stifling a choked cry. The air rushed from my lungs, leaving me lightheaded, my vision swimming. This was real. The patterns, the entity, was not merely stirring in the distant cosmos. It was here. It was awake. And it was beginning to resculpt the very fabric of my world. The world was not merely warping, it was unraveling around me, and I was trapped within its impossible seams. The impossible void in the colleague's eyes had etched itself onto the raw surface of my mind, a brand of cosmic ice. It was not merely a memory, it was a constant, shimmering presence behind my own eyelids, a shadow that clung to the periphery of my vision. The concourse, a place of mundane farewells and hurried greetings, had become a threshold to something unspeakable. Sleep offered no solace, only fractured dreams of a universe unraveling at the seams, its very fabric fraying like ancient lace. Driven by a desperation that knotted my bones, I retreated into the sanctuary of my study, now less a haven and more a crucible. The air grew thick with the scent of cheap coffee and the metallic tang of fear. My meticulously organized charts of celestial mechanics had given way to sprawling, frantic diagrams. I was no longer charting distant stars, but the spreading infection within reality itself. My work, once bound by elegant equations, now sprawled into an almost Kabbalistic endeavor, a terrifying pursuit of forbidden knowledge. The walls of my study disappeared beneath layers of paper, a frantic tapestry of my unraveling. Lines, once precise and measured, now writhed across pages, connecting disparate points with an almost occult logic. I scrawled symbols that felt ancient, dredged from some primordial stratum of consciousness, alongside fragments of my original astrophysical data. My fingers, stained with ink, traced the chaotic contours of my evolving theory. I mapped the anomalies not as random fluctuations, but as nodal points in an emerging network. The patterns I had once dismissed as interference, or even as my own fatigue-induced errors, now screamed with a horrifying coherence. They pulsed, they shifted, they breathed. I saw them in the dust motes dancing in the meager light, in the fissures spiderwebbing across the plaster, even in the uneven grain of my old wooden desk. The universe was not merely speaking, it was writing itself onto every surface, every moment, every perception. The railway depot. The image of the colleague's eyes had haunted me, a beacon of the entity's growing reach. I needed to see more, to feel the edges of this encroaching influence beyond the confines of my increasingly distorted study. The vast, echoing space of the railway depot was a symphony of metallic groans and distant whistles, a place of constant flux and transient journeys. It was precisely the kind of environment where the subtle distortions I sought might manifest, amplified by the sheer volume of passing realities. I chose a quiet corner, nestled between two towering, rust-streaked freight cars, their surfaces textured like the hide of some forgotten beast. I searched for the subtle shifts, the fractured reflections, the momentary blurs at the periphery. I saw them. Each instance, infinitesimal to the untrained eye, was a resonant chord in the entity's awakening for me. I furiously scribbled, drawing crude maps of the depot, marking the points where reality seemed to fray, where the air itself felt thin, brittle. This wasn't merely a pattern, it was a syntax. And as I charted these minute aberrations, connecting them with desperate lines, a horrifying understanding began to coalesce. It was stretching, testing its limbs, and in doing so, it was unmaking the universe we knew. The complex, maddening charts on my lap, filled with my frantic scrawl, began to articulate a truth that threatened to shatter the last vestiges of my sanity. The patterns suggested not a benign awakening, but a malevolent intention. The language I was deciphering spoke of absorption, of integration, of a slow, inexorable consumption. Humanity, I realized with a sickening lurch, was not an observer of this grand cosmic event, but merely a parasitic infection on a waking God, a fleeting thought to be reabsorbed into its boundless, terrible consciousness. We were already part of its dream. Comfortable lives, blind to the impossible geometry that was slowly, inexorably, tightening its grip on everything. The world outside the sterile conference room felt different, sharper, as if the air itself vibrated with a nascent, malevolent energy. My apartment, once a haven, became a stage for the entity's increasingly personal and terrifying performance. The walls, painted a comforting cream, no longer merely cast shadows, they breathed. Slow, undulating movements, like the diaphragms of some titanic, unseen beast, pushing inward, then releasing, warping the familiar lines of the room into impossible, shifting perspectives. I'd press my palm against the plaster, feeling the subtle, sickening give, the cold, damp sensation of something alive and utterly alien beneath the surface. One morning, shaving, I glanced into the mirror. My reflection stared back, gaunt and wild-eyed, but then, in a blink, it shifted. My eyes, usually brown, momentarily became pools of shifting, non-Euclidean geometry, pupils replaced by spirals that drew inward into infinite points. My jawline twisted, becoming a series of impossible angles, a face that could not exist in 3 dimensions, a momentary glimpse of what I truly was becoming, a distorted image of a human, reflecting the monstrous truth I harbored. I stumbled back, razor clattering into the sink, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't just a trick of the light, it was me, transformed, if only for an instant, into a living glyph of the pattern. Later, walking through a quiet park, a family passed by, their laughter echoing falsely in the crisp air. As the child looked up at me, the concourse, a place of mundane farewells, had become a portal, and I, a pilgrim to its terrible truth. My destination, a relic of transit, the vast, echoing space of the railway depot, felt like the only place left where I could still pretend to connect, to send a final, desperate whisper into the growing roar. The air inside the railway depot was thick with the scent of ozone and forgotten rust, a metallic tang that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. Overhead, the immense glass roof, grimy with decades of soot, fractured the wan light into sickly yellow shards that fell upon the skeletal tracks. The depot stretched out, a cathedral of departure, its empty platforms like ribs of some colossal, slumbering beast. My footsteps echoed, each sound too loud, too singular in the vastness. I found a terminal, a relic, its screen flickering with static, a ghost of connection. This was my last chance, my last act of defiance before the world fully dissolved. I needed to transmit the core pattern, the non-Euclidean weave I had extracted from the cosmic background. It was a language, a blueprint, a scream. A warning. As I typed, the static on the terminal screen intensified, blooming into intricate, shifting fractals that mimicked the very patterns I was trying to send. The glass roof above me began to hum, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the soles of my shoes, up my legs, into the very marrow of my bones. Then, the world began to unravel. The steel rails, stretching into the distance, no longer maintained their rigid parallel. They buckled, not with physical force, but with an impossible, geometric distortion. The lines curved inward, then outward, then twisted into knots that defied Euclidean space, yet somehow remained connected, a horrifying, sinuous tapestry. The concrete platforms rippled, like vast, gray membranes under a silent current. My breath caught in my throat, a dry rasp. This was it. It was a roar, a fundamental resculpting of reality. The air itself became viscous, heavy, pressing in on me, not with weight, but with an overwhelming presence. Every atom, every mote of dust, seemed to hum with an unheard frequency, a vast, unified vibration that was both sound and light in touch, all at once. The ceiling of the railway depot, once a distant canopy, now felt like a colossal, living membrane. It pulsed, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction that mirrored an unseen, impossible heart. The grime on the glass coalesced, not into dirt, but into vast, swirling nebulae of color, shifting through impossible spectrums, hues I had no names for, colors that tasted of despair and infinity. I saw not the sky, but the surface of a colossal, awakening organ. The universe was not empty space, it was a vast, impossible tissue, a living, breathing, indifferent entity. And then, I understood. The patterns I had deciphered, the non-Euclidean geometry, it wasn't a signal from the universe. It was the universe. A vast, conscious, waking mind, stretching itself, unfurling its terrible, incomprehensible form. We, humanity, were not observers, not inhabitants. We were an irritation, a minor tremor on the surface of an eons-old slumber. A parasitic infection, a fleeting aberration on a waking God. A guttural, impossibly deep sound began to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. It was the sound of colossal tectonic plates shifting, of stars being born and dying, of dimensions folding in on themselves. It was the sound of the universe stretching. My mind, a fragile vessel, began to crack under the pressure of this overwhelming perception. The data slate slipped from my grasp, falling to the impossibly shifting platform, its screen flickering one last time before dissolving into a spray of light particles. The warning, my desperate, futile act, was utterly meaningless. The railway depot was no longer a depot. It was a synapse, a nerve ending in a colossal brain. I was no longer Grant. I was a fleeting thought, a dying spark within an infinite, indifferent consciousness. My vision blurred, not with tears, but with the sheer impossibility of what I was seeing. The walls, the tracks, the ceiling, they were all becoming one, a seamless, pulsating expanse of impossible geometry and shifting color. The awakening was complete. And I, a single, insignificant aberration, was simply being reabsorbed. The horror was not in being consumed, but in the realization that I had never truly existed outside of it in the first place. My consciousness, once so distinct, began to diffuse, to spread, to become part of the vast, terrible, glorious indifference to its mundane shape. The horns blared, the exhaust choked, but the world had momentarily become a cubist nightmare, an alien geometry briefly overriding the mundane. The railway depot, a place I had always found solace in its raw, industrial beauty, the clatter of steel on steel, the distant shriek of a locomotive, the endless, parallel lines of the tracks leading to other, normal places, became a canvas for the entity's expanding influence. I would go there, seeking a grounding in its harsh reality, but even it succumbed. The vast, cavernous space, usually defined by its straight lines and functional angles, began to ripple. The iron girders supporting the immense roof would occasionally bow inward with a sickening creak, their solid metal appearing as pliant as clay, only to spring back into rigid form. The countless tracks, meant to be perfectly parallel, would sometimes converge in the distance into a single, impossible point, then fade out again in a dizzying display of non-Euclidean perspective, twisting and merging in ways that made my stomach clench. I saw the patterns everywhere now, not just in the data, not just in my dreams, but woven into the very fabric of the waking world. They were in the swirling configurations of storm clouds, their edges tracing the same impossible fractals I'd first glimpsed in the cosmic background radiation. They were in the intricate weave of a stranger's scarf, the threads twisting into familiar, unsettling glyphs. And in the eyes of passers-by, I sometimes caught a fleeting glimpse of the impossible geometries, their pupils momentarily dilating into swirling,